Eidetic is a company that has a great story of rising from their initial failure to create something special. Their entry for the Bubsy series on the PS1 almost meant the end for this young company, but they proved themselves by providing a prototype of what their engine could do. And at the same time, Sony was looking for developers to make games on their new PlayStation. This ended up being the perfect match, as Sony had a project called Syphon that needed a home. This is how the Syphon series began, and it released to both critical and financial success. A sequel followed just 1 year later, as Eidetic improved on the original in many ways. Just like the first, the sequel was a huge success. The developers were interested in continuing the series, but they had ambitious ideas for the third game. This was going to be released on the PS2 until partway through development, Sony requested that they make a new Syphon filter for the PS1. Join me as we take a look back at Syphon 3. During the mid-90s, Sony entered the gaming space with their PlayStation. This resulted in Sony looking for developers to make games for their platform. They had a planning document titled Syphon with some details and concepts about the potential game. Syphon would not find a home until Sony saw Eidetic's prototype engine. Eidetic had experienced a critical and financial flop with their first PlayStation game, but Sony was both impressed with this prototype along with liking that this team had experience for developing on their PlayStation. Eidetic began work on Syphon and ignored most of the ideas from the document to create a stealth action game. At this time, this was not a popularized genre. Taking gameplay inspirations from GoldenEye along with the first Tomb Raider, this team created a spy world grounded in reality. Syphon was released in 1999 and was a huge success for the studio. The team quickly got to work on a sequel. They did not want to reinvent the wheel, but rather add to the established formula. One aspect about the sequel that they wanted to include were scripted cinematic events that could all be done through gameplay. The initial game had cinematic elements, and with the sequel they wanted to push this further. Story was another focus, as the second game was going to have so many cutscenes that the game would need to be shipped on 2 discs. Within 1 year, Eidetic managed to release a sequel that improved on the first in several areas. With 2 sequels under their belt, Eidetic was then bought by Sony, and this resulted in them changing their name to Sony Ben Studios. The original idea for the third entry within this franchise was first to make the jump to the PS2. It was originally going to be called Syphon Online. The developers wanted to combine the gameplay of Syphon with the environments and rewards from the Diablo series. Online multiplayer on console platforms were very young during the PS2 generation, so this was going to be an ambitious project. The goal was to capture what people loved about Syphon and then be able to deliver that in an online space that could be completed in co-op with other players. The players could travel across the globe to complete objectives, and those environments would be randomly generated, providing a wealth of content. But Sony had other plans. Their PS2 released in 2000, and they noticed that the PS1 still had a larger install base, as many players had not upgraded to the newer system. This resulted in Sony requesting that Sony Ben put their new project on hold and make a new Syphon game for the PS1 to capitalize on that fan base. So Ben Studios was in a bit of a tough situation where they had been working on this new game that was now going to be on hold and needed to rush to complete an entirely new game for the PS1. To complete the game as timely as possible, Ben wanted to try and use what levels they had worked on for their original project to be used in this new PS1 entry, along with writing a story that could fit all of these different areas into the narrative. Since the original design was going to have the player traveling to different areas around the world, the writers now needed to try and piece together a story that would fit all of these locations together. This meant that the story was sort of hastily put together, unlike the prior two entries. The plot was going to center around our heroes being on trial for their supposed crimes against the United States. This resulted in a more flashback-centric story, and as a means for the developers to use all of the prior locations from the original build for this new PS1 entry. In the narrative, each character would give their account of different events, allowing the story to easily bop around to different locations. The developers wanted to use this design as a means to flesh out many of the side characters, along with showing their first interactions with Gabe or the agency. For example, players would revisit Costa Rica that was only seen through a cutscene in the first game, but now in 3, the players would have 2 missions dedicated to this area, one focusing on Gabe and the other on Leon. The story would also feature portions in present day as our cast tries to stop the current situation with the Syphon filter virus. With this being a third entry, the developers wanted to add in some new fun weapons for the player to use, like a weapon that could shoot through walls along with a shotgun with explosive rounds. In addition to this, minigames would be included and used in the similar scripting as seen in the second Syphon filter. It is important to note that during the development of Syphon Filter 1 and 2, Richard Hamm was the lead designer with Jeff Ross acting as the co-game designer. Hamm ended up leaving the project about 6 months in, which meant Jeff was promoted to lead game designer. He stated that while the game was mapped out when it came to its levels, finishing and implementing all the concepts was a hard task. This was a big challenge for the team to overcome through the development of Syphon Filter 3. This was sort of a sink or swim situation, and Jeff used his experience from the first 2 titles to now lead in this area. The level design was going to be a bit of both Syphon Filter 1 and 2. The first game has some areas that provide a lot of open-ended gameplay, while 2 featured many more scripted sequences. Syphon Filter 3 was going to be a combination of both of these designs. Syphon Filter was known as being a very challenging game, so much so that the developers worked to make Syphon Filter 2 more balanced, which is why you saw more of a liberal use of the checkpoint system in that entry. But the sequel still received criticism for being too hard. As such, the developers worked to address this further in their third entry. As a result, many of the instant fail stealth sections from the prior 2 entries would not be featured that much in this sequel. This meant that missions would focus less on putting the player down one path, but rather offering options for both action and stealth approaches. Syphon Filter 3 had a really odd development. Ben Studios was originally working on making the third entry as an online game that would mix in elements from the series along with some designs from Diablo. But at the same time, Sony was seeing how many PS1 owners did not jump on early to the PS2 within the first year. As a means to capitalize on the current PS1 audience, Sony requested Ben Studios to stop production on their new game and make another Syphon Filter for the PS1. This was not Ben's original vision for the third entry and resulted in a hasty production. And on top of all of this, their lead game designer left during the production of the game. This was a less than ideal development cycle for the team, but they managed to complete the project within 1 year. In November 2001, Syphon Filter 3 was released to the world. Syphon Filter 3 is a stealth action third-person shooter. In many ways, this game feels like a product of a troubled development. While there are positives about the story, there are also parts that feel half-baked and lacking in execution. The same goes for the gameplay. There are a good amount of bright spots for the game, but there are also more examples of flaws, and many of these come down to design, rather than being dated in some areas. That being said, this third entry is still pretty fun, and shows how the gameplay is strong enough to pull up some of the weaker elements of this game. Syphon Filter 3 is a fun game that can also be very lacking at times. The game controls and operates similar to the prior 2 entries. For combat, you have 1 or 2 options for the shooting. You can opt to hold down the lock-on button and the camera will swing in on the direction of your enemy. You can hit the button again to lock on to another target. For more precision, you can manually aim to go in for some of those lethal headshots. The first-person view allows you to lean left and right, allowing you to use cover and fire at the same time. The same meters make a return as well with the target and damage meters. The target meter lets you know the likelihood of hitting your target. You can crouch to improve your accuracy. The damage meter lets you know if you're about to take damage. Hiding and rolling decreases this bar. For the most part, the action is about on par with the prior games. The shooting is satisfying along with the good blood effects, and that nice detail remaining on shot enemies. The guns have good sound effects and impact along with enjoyable enemy deaths. Even the improved checkpoint system from 2 is back as well. One thing that I want to make note of is how the flak jacket enemies seem weaker in this game. I honestly do not know if you could shoot through body armor with any weapon other than the special ones that could pierce those vests in the prior 2 games. You honestly may have been able to eventually break the body armor in the first 2 games, but those games were substantially harder. So anytime I would try it, I would die before I could potentially know what would happen. But in 3, it seemed like if you dump enough ammo into an enemy, no matter what gun you are using, their jacket will eventually break. Overall, I like this because you can eventually take out an enemy who has body armor with your current weapon through the lock-on mechanic, or you can use the manual aim for a headshot. It feels more like a choice rather than a requirement to fight a certain way. Most levels allow you to tackle them in either action or a stealth approach. The freedom in approach is appreciated here.
That new spy game coming out next year. I hate those things. They're never like the real.
The biggest difference between this entry and the prior 2 is how this game feels a lot more straightforward. Syphon Filter 3 feels like they dropped the enjoyable scripted puzzle-like sequences that started in the first game and could be found around almost every corner in the second. I love these situations since the game smartly designed dilemmas that provided the player with clues on how to complete them, but it was all up to the player to put 2 and 2 together to overcome the challenges. For example, in Syphon Filter 2, you are tasked with rescuing 2 GIs. They are being guarded by 2 enemies. Through the problem solving, you find out that the only way to proceed is to wait for the patrolling guard to walk in front of the stationary guard and get a double headshot. This type of design made the player feel smart and was very rewarding. This type of stuff is mostly absent within the third entry, and that is where a returning player might feel like everything is a lot more straightforward, and as a result, the game feels a lot easier to complete. I really enjoyed Syphon Filter 1 and 2, and I do think that both games needed more balancing and less cheapness in certain areas for the difficulty. But if the trade-off is that the game has a more rewarding design with some cheap situations, or something more straightforward without the smart design, then I would rather go with the first option. Now, even with 3 having weaker design, that doesn't mean that there aren't fun, enjoyable levels here. I really enjoyed the first level and found it to be an enjoyable set piece. Here you need to engage in a sniper battle with some enemies in another building, and then new objectives are brought up. This part of the Syphon Filter design is retained in this entry, where you enter a level with one objective, and by the end you had several more that popped up throughout the stage. Following the sniper sequence, you need to find your way out of the hotel, and this is bookended with a fun hostage situation. There isn't much in the way of problem solving, but it is a solid set piece. In Mission 2, there is a light amount of problem solving where Gabe needs to get past a minefield, but the manner in which you solve this again goes with more what Syphon Filter 3 is shooting for, a more straightforward experience. You eventually find the mine detector through some light exploration, and while this doesn't have the same level of problem solving, I do want to give the game credit for some of the small moments like this in the game. Sadly, in Mission 3, the game really drops the ball when it comes to the first boss encounter, along with the lack of problem solving in a situation that could have used it. I will get into this more later when I discuss the bosses. Mission 6 is another highlight as you play as Leon and need to contend with some snipers. Here you get a small town that you get to fight in. While it is mostly linear, there are a few different paths that you can take out the snipers. The freedom in parts of this level are really fun as the player exploration is rewarded. I enjoyed the fun level on the cargo ship along with the following action-packed level on the waterfront. The tank boss fight is probably my favorite in the game as it is a set piece type boss event. You need to take out a large amount of enemies along with sneaking up on the tank to plant some C4 on it to blow it up. Levels in Syphon Filter 3 generally feel more straightforward and either range from situations that can be tackled with stealth or action, or situations that are just focused on the action. Like I said before, this feels like a regression in what they accomplished in the prior 2 games, but I also had a lot of fun in this game as well. To the game's credit, there's still some very memorable levels along with fun moments of finding hidden special weapons. Easily the best and most underrated aspect about Syphon Filter 3 is the inclusion of the minigame mode. This mode allows you to select the level, mission type, difficulty, along with which character you want to play as. Assassinate is all stealth focused, where you need to take out the opposition without being seen. Elimination is where you need to take everyone out, and how you do it is up to you. Demolition is similar to those missions in the first game where you need to guard a guy as he defuses a bomb. Thief is where you need to steal a briefcase and then bring it back to the starting point. And then there's a sniper rifle like challenge minigame. The variety of missions are pretty good, mixed with a sizable amount of maps. On top of this, the difficulties will change up many aspects like how many enemies you fight, the time you have, how many bombs you need to disarm, and many more. I really love this addition to the game. It provides the player with a fleshed out challenge mode and provides you with an avenue to enjoy that Syphon Filter action either in bite-sized chunks or for hours of endless content. There is also a bit of randomization to each of the modes. For example, when I played Assassinate, enemies might be in different positions along with my starting position changing. You really get to see the small inclusion of having enemies being randomly set and generated. My only issue with this mode is the lack of a two-player co-op option. Syphon Filter did have competitive multiplayer, but I think for allowing for a two-player co-op version in this mode would have been great. And it sort of would have made sense since the developers were looking to make an online co-op game for their first build of Syphon Filter 3. And while this would not have been online, I think couch co-op would have fit in just nicely. This mode does not get discussed enough, with Syphon Filter 3 usually being seen as the black sheep of the PlayStation 1 entries. But this mode is very good and one of the best aspects about the game. The minigames are a welcomed addition. Now when it comes to the story, I mostly enjoyed it, but I did have some issues in the execution. I did like how the game lets you experience some small stories from the different side characters. In a way, the game acts as a celebration of the cast, and I enjoyed that aspect of it. Also, the cutscene quality received a nice bump.
I'll monitor your progress from the rendezvous point.
Right.
Guess what? Bad news. I just got a call from Lawrence. We've been called to testify before a Senate committee investigating the Syphon Filter scare.
Great.
One of my biggest issues with Syphon Filter's story is how the concept is really interesting, but the execution could have been done a lot better. The idea of having each one of the characters being interrogated and then experiencing those flashbacks could have been more engaging. We could have had situations where Gabe lies during the trial, or only tells a half-truth, and then we experience what really happened in the level that we get to play. This could help keep the mystery alive. Or we could experience two characters' accounts of the same event and have those levels reflect their different interpretations of the events. But instead, the story takes a very boring approach to this interesting concept. Also, much of the story in this game feels like needless filler. If many of the flashbacks were built around a central mystery, where we are trying to piece things together, that may have been more interesting. But here, we get to see these characters' backstories that feel unneeded, and just like the main narrative, it feels like it's just spinning its wheels. To the game's credit, the flashbacks do have some loose connections, but it doesn't feel as connected as it probably should be, and results in some lackluster storytelling. Like many issues in this game, I honestly blame it on Syphon Filter 3 being more of a mandated project from Sony, rather than being something that these developers wanted to do. And this is one of those situations where you can really feel this stuff in the game itself, and the story execution is a good example of this. Another thing that felt odd was how some cutscenes would look like they cut off too early, either through the action on screen or the dialogue. It made some of these feel jarring and not as good as they were in the prior two. The game does a bad job at telling you that some missions are in present day while most of the game are in flashbacks. This is conveyed through a briefing screen where the actual cutscene should have done that heavy lifting, letting us know about the non-linearity in the story. This sort of stuff felt lazy, along with how some of the new characters were just thrown into the game. In some ways, this feels like I'm watching a heavily edited studio cut of a film. To be clear, the story itself isn't bad. It's pretty entertaining and enjoyable with some nice moments, but it could have been a lot better. I also had a bunch of flaws when it came to the design of the game. One area that I thought took a hit in this one were the boss fights. Outside of the fun tank sequence, I didn't really care for these encounters. The first boss fight is really lazy as well. So in Mission 3, you need to fight Romer, and he is in a similar set of full body armor as Chance was at the end of Syphon Filter 2. And you know how I knew this? The game told me this in the briefing. And this fight feels like a recycled fight for it. You need to find the same shotgun you used on Chance to now push Romer out the back of a plane. where this fight had awesome and rewarding problem solving in 2. In 3, it mostly just handed it to the player in a straightforward manner, and as a result, it's very boring and not rewarding. Now, if done better, this could have been a nice tribute to the boss fight in 2, but that isn't the case in this game. Syphon Filter 3 essentially gives you the answers and removes any of the problem solving that could have been associated with this encounter. Some of the cheap elements from the prior 2 games make a return as well, like the one-shot grenades along with the headshot sniper enemies. The levels in this game also have odd respawning for enemies. In some cases, they will instantly respawn near you after you took everyone out. Respawning enemies were used in the series in some areas that made sense for them, like the battle at the warehouses in the first, but it is used too much in Syphon Filter 3. This game can feel very uneven at times, but for the majority of it, even with the less compelling design, it's still a lot of fun. There's some fun situations and good set pieces as well. This is easily the weakest of the original PlayStation trilogy. Thankfully, the soundtrack mostly delivers with some memorable tracks. Here are a few tracks from the game. Syphon Filter 3 is a flawed but fun game. It retains the core third-person stealth action gameplay that is still very enjoyable, but in other areas it can feel disappointing. The problem solving introduced in 1 and featured almost everywhere in 2 is one of the best aspects about the series on the PS1. Situations were set up like mini dilemmas or puzzles where the player could piece clues together. Solving these situations were memorable and provided a great amount of satisfaction to the player. Sadly, this is an area that is mostly missing within this third entry. The problem solving is traded for a mostly straightforward experience. This new design isn't necessarily bad. It is still fun, but it feels like a big step down compared to the prior game. Outside of the fun tank fight, the boss fights lack the specialness factor that 1 and 2 had. The same goes for the story. The concept and ideas used in the narrative are good, but the execution is where it fumbles often. It results in a narrative that mostly feels like filler and full of unneeded information. While Bend Studios were the developers on this game, I mostly blame Sony for this mixed third entry. This is obviously not what the developers had in mind when making their third game, but Bend Studios had recently been purchased by Sony, and so I think Sony had a lot of power in this situation. Knowing the development of this game, you can better understand how this game played out as well. Syphon Filter 3 is a flawed but fun game, and while not on par with the prior two, if you are a fan of the series, it is still worth playing. Thank you very much for watching.